Oh, thanks. Kia ora. Thanks everyone for coming to the workshop on the representation review. I've just got a few things to take you through today and some work that's been done. But just wanted to give you a heads up. What we want from today is I'll run you through some feedback that we had today on the representation review. What we would love to come out of the workshop today with is narrowing down our options so that at the Strategic Working Committee on the 3rd of July, we can present you with 2 to 3 options for representation arrangements. And just also an understanding today of what those options mean. We've got Stephen Hill, who I've been working with from electionsnz.com, who has been advising me coming in at around 12:30 today. So what I would quite like to do is just run through the presentation with you all, and if you could just save up your questions, it would be great to have those with Stephen's online, and then he can provide some additional answers as well. So the idea is to get you as much information today as we possibly can heading into this work that we need to do in July. So just a bit of a recap. Representation review takes quite a long time, and there's been a bit of work that's been going on so far. So there were a couple of high-level papers that came to council in 2023. There were 2 decisions that took place outside of the whole representation review last year. One was the decision to go with status quo for first past the post for the 2025 and 2028 local elections, as opposed to the single transferable vote. So we will be going first past the post. And the second was the establishment of Māori wards for 2025 and 2028 local election on the 27th. We've also since then had a couple of workshops earlier this year, and since that workshop on the 1st of May, we've done a little bit more engagement with our community on representation, and that has been predominantly in 2 ways. We have included flyers and done some presented to and had chats with our community as part of the enhanced annual plan drop-in sessions. So representation was included in those sessions. And we've also done an online survey, which we've pushed out through Facebook. I've also taken papers to the community boards over the last month. So just to go through, after that initial engagement, and just being aware that we're very much on a journey, so the engagement is very early days. There were some key themes and findings. We had 61 people respond to our online survey. A number of those just filled out their name and email address, so I haven't given you their feedback, but what we will do is collect that information and send them through the consultation once we kind of hit that phase. So predominantly most of the information you're going to see today is from around about 47 people who completed the online survey, so a very small percentage. Also, a lot of those that filled out the online survey were identified as from the Martinborough ward, so a very high weighting towards Martinborough, so just keep that in the back of your mind. There are 5 things I want to talk to you about today. Support for the current wards. There is, I want to talk to you about less councillors at large and rural wards, which are 2 new options, and also community boards. So we would like to bring a paper to the Strategic Working Committee next week and ask for some very clear direction from you all on your preferred option for representation. We will then go away and do work on that, and on the 31st of July, we would require adoption. That is the legislative deadline for the representation review. So not much wiggle room there.
That's 31 July.
Yeah. So we'll kind of get a steering from you next week, and then do a whole lot of work during July.
Okay.
But we do need adoption by the 31st of July.
Right.
I'll just ask a question about electoral boundaries. Is this part of what we're doing?
Yep.
As well?
Yep.
So that'll come up in the conversation. Yep.
Absolutely. So we saw a little bit of support in the survey for our current ward structure, Martinborough, Greytown and Featherston, And there seemed to be a little bit of rhetoric from our community around that they like the fact that we have representation in those 3 areas because they still see them as quite different. I would highly recommend reading the comments in the survey pack. The survey pack is on Stellar and was emailed out to you last night. The comments are quite interesting because it helps you understand why people have chosen certain things. There's also quite a few comments, so just be aware of that. We had a couple of comments like, oh, we would really love to keep the ward system, but maybe if those councillors who are in Greytown could just vote on the Greytown issues, that would be great. And obviously we can't do that under legislation. So that also helps us just prepare for the consultation going forward. So we need to make sure that our communication and our understanding of what the representation of you is really crystal clear to our community going forward.
I did notice, Nikki, how a lot of people were commenting how in the survey it never had the option of keeping the same amount of councillors.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we were after a few interesting things. So we had 47 people respond online to the question, do you think the current water boundaries reflect your property? And 35 said yes. So we just wanted to highlight, we believe that there's a bit of a support for the current ward system when you kind of go through your considerations. The second one is less councillors. So we had quite a lot of support online for having less councillors. And I just wanted to, in the paper that will come to you next week, I've included a little bit more detail around this. But it included elements like less members means pay per member could increase and may be more reflective of the hours of work of our elected members. So there is definitely some communication going on from individuals in the community kind of understanding the pay allocation. There are also a few comments around the current representation system could result in weak governance. Smaller population councils and elected members are at risk of becoming kind of a little bit overall collegiate and parochial. While SWDC exists, there needs to be at least 7 elected members with at least 3 members at large. So quite a few comments into the real detail in regards to the release.
Okay, can I just ask a question about your blue option up there? We should have left councillors.
Yeah.
You think there's clarity in our communities about the difference between community boards and councillors? Because sometimes people get this impression that we're all one, I guess, and they think 7 councillors and it's 3 councillors and 4 community board members is completely over the top in terms of representation. Do you think that was clear enough in your question about?
No, I think we need to do a bit of work around that.
Yeah, so I think that may have captured community board sentiment as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, all good. There are a couple of things I just wanted to note here. Just in terms of good governance, the recommendation is 7 councillors. Also, just have a think about, because you're the best people to know how many should be at this table. Even numbers can result in a split vote. So just thinking about how council works, how council votes. Also just being aware that larger numbers help with quorum. So if people are away sick, there's kind of some procedural stuff there that needs to be considered if you were really serious about reducing your councillor numbers. So we just highlighted those for you. Also, I just wanted to give you a bit of a comparison because you're not actually a big council. So compared to other councils of similar size, you're pretty much on par with where the other councils are at the moment. So it's not like you are carrying extra fat compared to other councils at the moment.
Nikki,
Yeah.
quickly, what was it on the previous one? The bottom one, larger numbers can help with the quorum, but that is something that can be looked at if the numbers change, doesn't it? We wouldn't have to keep the same quorum for each of our like this meeting groups.
Councillors,
Then we may only need less, for that. So I mean, that is one way around it. So although at the moment, obviously it would be hard if we needed 6 in the quorum. That wouldn't necessarily be the case if we only had 7. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, you can sit what you want to, what you think is good. decision making and what we bring them to. So yeah, you can absolutely change it. I guess the point here is just, these are some of the things you should consider. We land compared to other councils is quite proportionate anyway. So it's probably just thinking about, we should have less councils. Why? What was the question? What was the rationale behind that? And maybe getting into some of those verbatim comments and just trying to figure that out. And maybe that's come back to.
Councillors will result in less experience and expertise around the table. Because I think less opinions, but also less talent that you're tapping into.
That's definitely a risk, less
Yeah.
diversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like they are valid risks.
Yeah.
I think some of the reasons for having less that we hear coming through the community is that people don't necessarily understand why we're all here, like why so many of you? And perhaps less councillors equals less cost, and so see it as a cost saving measure.
No, that's chosen separately.
But that's not necessarily accurate either. So I think there's a level of education sounds not quite right, but just a level of understanding of why the numbers are the way they are.
Yes, I just think the number of tasks that we have to do and that some of us can hive off, you know, I mean, but I'm looking at the housing thing, for example, you know, there's just so much you can do if people can take different tasks, you know, because if you think about how much work each of us are doing, the number of hours per week on average, and we put that down to a fewer number of councillors, and if the salary isn't going to go up enough that people can not have, like, you know, people like Aidan, they have to have a full-time job because they've got families to support and things like that. I think it doesn't really work.
I support that, Kay, because you're right. The workload won't
No,
decrease.
No,
it's not like central government won't go, oh, there's only 7 of you.
Yeah, so
Don't worry about water.
all of the things we have to achieve, all of the committees we have to service stay. So the workload is just spread over fewer people.
Yeah.
But the remuneration at the moment is such that even with
Still wouldn't make it.
two less of us,
Yeah.
it wouldn't allow for most people to have this as their main income.
remuneration would
Need-
realistically, we have to go up to $100,000
And that's not going to
minimum for everyone. So
From your lips to God's ears.
Stay quiet on the whole issue of remuneration right now.
no, it
Yesterday.
just doesn't work. Yeah, that doesn't work.
I still think there's some confusion in our communities about the number of councillors around the table. If people follow council, we'll see clearly that we are a relatively small council, what we have to deal with. But if you add the mix of community boards into that, then that level of governance increases tenfold. And I think the perception in our community is still the fact that the community board are seen as council to a large extent, or councils, you know, so I think we really need to get some.
Or the opposite, that they're adversary council.
Yeah, well, yeah.
There's certainly a cost to council.
They certainly are a cost, and I think any survey we do in the future must really clearly identify the difference between community board and council select, because we are the decision makers, they're not.
Just be aware then with this. And as Nikki pointed out, a lot of them are from Martinborough and they're all saying they want to keep community boards.
Yeah, I saw that, yeah.
And it is what it is because Martinborough, it doesn't matter, it's got the biggest land mass out of the wards. It's a huge area for a councillor to look after on their own, if that's how the split ended up being. And they feel that they find it easier to be able to be heard, to have that where they can, you know, touch on that heartlands. I say heartland because I think of it like rugby. I always do. I always think of it like rugby. They're our roots, you know, grassroots. And then, you know, we kind of sit here at the blues level.
I hear what you're saying.
And then central government's more.
We're jumping ahead. I talk about community boards, but I
And we
think,
are doing,
yeah.
I've got that.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I certainly, having read through here, don't get any sense at all that anybody is confusing a council role with a community role. If anything, what they're saying is community board should have a better defined role. And that comes through, doesn't matter whether it's from Martin or from Featherston. It's not so many from Greytown, but it seems to be, and as you say, the majority of them are in favour.
Okay, I'm gonna keep moving along here. So I wanted us to spend a little bit of time thinking about a new option for 2025 and 2028, which is at-large representation. So we have seen some support for this from our community, and this support has been seen in both some of the discussions I've had at the enhanced AP sessions and has also come through online on the survey. Just noting that the survey included a mix of councillors and also councillors at large, which Councillor Woodcock was one of the ideas that you raised at the last workshop. So just a total of 53% included at-large representation in the online survey. I think this is something that needs to be considered as one of your options going forward for next week's strategy working committee. Just noting that you can't obviously have a fully at-large system party wards, but also that you have still got community support for your ward system. So this is something that I think needs to be thought about as being a new introduction for 2025 and 2028.
And what, I'm quite in favour of exploring this option further. Just wondering if we've got any guidance or insight at this point around what that split would look like, based purely on maintaining the numbers we have, so as not to complicate the idea further. Would you look at something like 2 ward councillors per ward and then 3 at large? Or
one of the 3 would be the Māori ward, because that's also at large, but
yeah,
I
but yeah, or in is the, I guess, yes, the first decision is the Māori ward on top of our current numbers or integrated in, and then what is the split for the large?
Yes.
So 222.
This is what we consulted on. This came to the last workshop and was also in the survey. So you can see option 3 included 2 at large, and was the option that included at large representation.
Can I ask a question here? And it's reinforced through this document. All I hear, so there's a couple of things I would say. First, the thing, and Pip and Colin will probably back me up on this, being on council for a long time. Sitting in your, representing you, from your community perspective, people know who we are. And great, walk down the street, Boz walks down the street, Pip walks down the street, Colin walks down the street. People in Featherston or Martin, they know who you are. And that's part of what makes this actually quite good. But the second thing I would say to you, and the biggest comment I get, and I spend quite a bit of time talking to farmers, is that they don't feel represented at all. And that reinforces it. We didn't even go out with an option.
Yeah, that's coming up. That's coming up.
Yeah, but that's your options. You can,
no, but it was in there.
it's,
I wonder, sorry, if we can just move, sorry, Mark.
I just finished my
speak. I can't see the bottom figures and yeah, that's them.
And the other thing I would say is that the 9 councillors is, given the amount of work, which is, as Boss rightly pointed out the other day, significantly more than probably most people have ever thought of. And I remember you asked me how much work was on it before, and probably I said less than what you probably do, didn't I? In terms of time. And if you went down to any less, just the sheer number of things you've got to read and things you've got to get your head around. If you go down to 8 or 7, it's going to make a mockery. You're just not going to have the time to do all the work.
I think the number's pretty good, but
I think 9 is I think 3 per town is actually, 3 per ward is good. I don't like the ward structure itself. But I'm not a fan of at large, because I think it would destroy the community.
So what do you
vibe around the
3 councillors per ward as it sits at the moment?
Yeah, but I would split those into having one of those as a rule for each.
Yeah. So you're talking
So I had 2 urban, 1 rural,
1 per ward.
That's why.
Okay, I'm gonna talk about that in a minute, so bear with me slightly,
We'll bear with you.
discuss with the rural wards.
There always is.
Yeah, so as you can see, option one is current status quo, so option one would be status quo for us.
These numbers, when it says total councillors, is plus the mayor,
Yes,
just don't include the mayor.
correct, so just a reminder as well that it needs to be plus minus 10% for representation, so we've got a mathematical equation that we need to comply with. So, these examples relate to the options that we gave earlier, to get a feel for just, status quo versus introducing, something new, which was at large. And, if you read through the comments, a number of those other arrangements down the bottom included greater at-large representation than option, for example, 3 gave them.
So more than two.
Two, yeah. Yeah. Okay, rural wards, woohoo. So this is something that I'm very keen to have a discussion on, and I do have a little bit to talk about here. And keeping in mind that we will just park any questions that we might need support with for when Stephen comes online as well in an hour. So one of the questions we ask is, do you feel the current ward and boundaries reflect where your property is? And bear in mind, this was a survey of effectively 47 to 61 people. Most of those were Martinborough, and most of them came back and said yes. So very, very small survey compared to our total community.
Mm.
The work that I've done over the last month means that if we were introduced a rural ward, what would happen?
So,
Rewards. Well, we need to see what we're eligible for, but yeah, rewards is that how it would work is that the boundary lines for Martinborough, Greytown and Featherston would change. So basically the towns would become the boundary. So the boundary lines would fall around each town, and then the rural ward would sit at large outside across the whole district.
so Nick, when we had our first workshop and we put up the numbers, it worked out, I think about 3,000 people in each ward currently.
Yeah.
And within that, 2,000 lived in the urban and 1,000 lived in the rural. And so I don't see why it needs to be large. You could just do exactly what you're talking and say Greytown, for example, is the town boundary. And then the other ward within that existing ward, so you don't need to change the ward boundaries. You just say, if you live in Greytown, you vote for 2 councillors. If you live rural, you vote for 1.
The ward has to have boundary lines that can be the same.
Yeah.
So your ward lines have to be.
But they would be different because you'd have the ward for Greytown you'd have Greytown sitting there, and then around that, Greytown rural.
Yeah, potentially, if the numbers.
So you could have 3 wards, you could have 3 wards, which would enable
Yeah.
then the farmers from the current Greytown ward to elect their representative. And that's
I
really,
disagree. I'm sorry. I just have to jump in here because we've banged on this every single time we change a thing. And I just think, one, we need to move on, but also like until we get to the end of it, and then we can go into it a little bit further. But I mean, I'm just disagreeing because there's too many out of those. I think we need to take out all of the lifestylers and things like that don't consider themselves rural. But you know, and that's something else that could be looked at with regards to those boundaries, because we certainly have a lot around here that you know they consider themselves living and they get the amenities as well.
Councillor's got something to say.
I was just going to say, can we let Nikki carry on before we get too deep in the conversation, because she's information she has, and we can see what Stephen says around numbers.
Yeah, I'd really like Stephen to be part of this conversation as well, because his guided me so far on what a rural ward would look like, and you'd have to excuse my lovely GIS man, which was hand drawn. Yes.
No way. Hey, no way.
So there is a huge amount of complexity in introducing rural wards. I just want to be really clear about this up front. So there is complexity in the work that needs to be done by council staff, and there is complexity in the understanding of this for our communities, and complexity in understanding those boundary lines, because there could potentially be some options, as Councillor Plummer kind of pointed out earlier. But effectively what we would be doing is changing every boundary line. So reducing the size of Martinborough, Greytown, Featherston, and then looking at the numbers for those rural areas. And those numbers would dictate where that representation would fall
And how many councillors?
and how many councillors.
Do we run the risk of making the boundary lines and the wards and the whole system just way more complicated? Like, I'm yet to form a position on what's right and which way we should go, but I worry that local government doesn't have a huge community uptake already. It's overall, it's kind of complicated and a bit mysterious. If we start adding in new wards, new boundaries, new voting umbrellas, do we just make it more complicated than people can kind of already cope with?
Yeah, so you would effectively, if you went with that lovely drawing, you would effectively have 4 wards plus a Māori ward, plus at large sitting over top of all of it. So you've got quite a smorgasbord of everything there, which is quite confusing.
Me as a voter, sorry, myself as a voter living in Featherston Township, under this lovely drawing model, I'd get a ward vote and an at-large vote, but I wouldn't get a multi-ward vote unless I was on the multi-roll.
Correct. And you wouldn't
I'd get a
vote.
And I wouldn't get a rural vote.
Yeah, because your boundary line wouldn't sit in the.
But I would, so I'd vote for the mayor, I'd vote for 2 ward councillors and an at-large, far out, okay.
Yeah. So I just want to be really crystal clear about this. I'm looking for direction, so obviously the decision sits very much with next week, so some time to think about it, but yeah.
With the Māori ward, you vote for that if you're on the Māori roll. How would you determine who votes for a rural ward?
So that would be the boundary lines.
So it would be, so if you're in the rural, sorry, hold on, if you're in the rural ward, you could vote for those candidates standing there and at large, but you wouldn't vote for the people in the town.
Yeah, so that means somebody who might just have a small section in the area voting in a rural ward. They've got no interest in agriculture, I think. Yeah.
Correct. So it is just a little bit more complex. And so this is the kind of the data that we showed at the last workshop, just to give you a feel for currently where things fall with our population.
Sorry, Nikki, one more question. Probably maybe for both Councillor Plummer and yourself. So in terms of rural ward versus at large, like pros and cons, so Alistair, when you champion the rural ward, what do you see the benefits of that as opposed to at large?
You know, can I just stand up? So,
I'm going to go back to my map.
this,
Yeah.
and there, and each of those is 1,000 people live in the rural there, 1,000 people live in the rural there, 1,000 people live in the here.
Yeah,
That's
so
putting
get
on
that.
that figures.
But
So you would have.
But it's not.
Well, that's.
It is, it's 37% of the population that live
In
rurally,
each ward,
live across the
yeah,
population.
that's what I mean. That's just, it's not.
Not at large, the only at large is.
I get that. No,
And there.
what I'm trying to understand is what do you see as the benefits to the community for having that set up versus an at large or what we've currently got?
So the rural community gets their voice heard around the table. And let's face it, they pay the significant amount of rates. And you hear it all the time that they are not represented.
So
Hang on a second, so you just represented them and Aidan's represented them and at the workshop last year.
That could change next election. That could change next election.
Hey, and that's always the case. We could end up with everyone rural on here.
So I'm not, I'm genuinely just trying to view the pros and cons.
I do not see any
rural
need
against
for
at
an
large.
at large at all, except for the Māori ward.
So-
That is the only at large and the miracles, but the rest of it can be done on ward basis.
My only
It needs to be that complicated.
People here arguing for at large, so Alison, a lot of people.
Out of 47.
But not the same.
And yeah,
But I guess that's what I'm trying to understand is what is, if kind of the big decision is wards versus large, what do we view the benefits of a rural ward
Okay,
as
so
opposed to at large?
What I
Because
would
to my mind,
actually
at
the
large,
benefit that I would see is that our southern coast.
So just let Melissa finish.
no, it was kind of, that's kind of where I was going. What could be achieved in a rural ward that can't be achieved through at large or advocating to our rural communities to actually put up
Yeah,
their
there's thousands of them.
candidates?
What I've been saying to a lot of these farmers that
yeah.
they'll start looking. So for instance, they've got generational farms. The son might be starting to take over, so the dad's got a bit more time on his hands. They should be the guys coming in,
Yeah, yeah.
Start putting their hand up.
putting their hand up. Like
Yeah.
the son's now doing this.
Everybody knows them.
They've got more time sort of thing, you know?
Everybody knows them.
Look at themselves a little bit as well.
Yes, I quite.
I mean, I don't disagree with you that our geographical mass is diverse and that our rural and coastal communities have very specific needs. I'm just, at this point, not sure that the rural ward or at large necessarily gives them the representation that we're trying to achieve.
But like Pip said too, you have got this side of rural, this side of rural and a bit in between, you know, you've got the coastal, you've got the lifestyle and then you've got the.
Yeah, I mean, do we create, by that argument, do we?
Differences, you know.
Yeah, and then you have someone saying, look, I'm sick of this, coastal's not represented. You know, we've got this massive coastline and coastal's not being properly represented. So then do we have to go from rural to coastal?
That's what I was about
At large, we can actually like
I was about to say, if you had a vote for Martinborough, for the current Martinborough ward, you would get it would be mainly coastal because that's where all the land is.
Could I?
You get the people's vote.
I'd really like to ask a question. And you might have said, excuse me, I'm a little bit more brain dead than usual, but the number of people. The number of rural people, number of rural voters the number of percentage of rural voters that we've got here. What do you have?
So
that figure?
I would need to work with Stats New Zealand
Yeah.
on a mesh block level to get that data.
But would you have
that data, hang on.
From the 2018 census data, which is different to the data that was on the board because that's data that's been given to us directly for the representation review by Stats.
Yeah.
It's more accurate. We have got Aorangi Forest at the back of Martinborough is 1,464. Kahutara is 1,035. Tōwhara Mikau is 1,353. Noting that Kahutara and Tōwhara Mikau are two areas that have expressed concerns about where they are currently positioned in their wards.
So could you give me an idea of approximately what percentage of voters?
1,000. So that would be
The percentage.
37% is rural.
A third of each ward, yeah. So yeah, it's just saying, you know, it seems that percentage of voters, they should be able to get a candidate in, or some candidates in that
Yeah.
represent them if they get organised.
Yeah, so I'm quite, yeah.
Can I just throw another spanner in the works? I've seen someone comment on here, which is quite funny, because when we run for council, I had a lot of people in the Featherston and Martinborough ward that said, Woody, we would have voted for you if you were on our ward. And then someone in one of the questions I read last night in the survey pack actually stated that why can't they vote for people in other wards when because they're still councillors in your district? So why aren't people allowed to vote for each ward, like all three wards?
Because it's a ward. Because it's a ward.
Whereas where the at large comes into debate, see?
And as a candidate, you would then choose whether you were standing in your ward or at large.
Yeah.
Correct. So the answer to that is at large because everybody votes for at large and the ward very much dictates who you vote for.
And I think when you look at the at large thing, I think those people would probably suck a lot of the rural votes if they were rural type of
So,
person.
actually, and I just wanted to, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate with you, Councillor Plummer. So I just for the rural ward, I want to just think about a couple of things in particular because this is so complex. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page with this one. So first off, I just want clarification on who is asking for this ward and very aware that you all have conversations that I'm not privy to. And as Councillor Plummer mentioned, that there is a lot of conversations going on from that rural community for representation. One of the things that I am keen to investigate further with the survey is we had a lot of people identify as in their wards, but ask for rural wards. So we just need to be clear, those asking for rural wards, would they actually fall in rural wards? Who is asking for this? And if you were to move everything around and change the boundary lines, would those people who are asking for rural wards be in that?
That's a good point.
Yeah, and you probably have a much better idea.
I don't sort of have that conversation, sitting having their cup of coffee in town. I have that conversation when I'm on the sideline of the rugby field.
Yeah.
So I do know where they live, you know.
But
But I know what you're saying, Alice, but you kind of do, right? Like, so, I mean, I think we can say that there's probably more that fit within the Featherston, out Western Lake area and that, you know, and then the Martinborough district all the way around. That's where the rural sits, and there's not a massive rural area in Greytown. So it's not.
Well,
Is it? No, but is it 1,000?
Yeah, farms out there.
I mean, is it 1,000? Oh, well, that's right.
Just cutting, right?
No, wait, yeah, you include Taranaki now, don't you? So that's right, yeah.
Side of the road.
Sorry, I forgot. I still think of that as Featherston.
But this is.
We do.
I know.
If you change the boundary line, so one of the issues that has been raised is that people in Kahutara and Te Wharenekau don't feel their boundary lines are right. So if the boundary lines were adjusted to make them make more sense for
That's just Colin.
for instance,
I don't think so.
Te Wharenekau and Kahutara becoming more of Featherston, would the numbers for rural in Greytown still stack up?
No.
Can we move
Yeah.
on to Featherston?
You're not gonna keep
No,
everyone happy.
Martin, you had a question.
Thank you. So I want to pick up and really support what Councillor Maynard's saying, because the boundary lines, as all boundary lines are always going to be a remarkably sort of arbitrary thing, and it's, you know, short of having an individual, you know, do you want to be in this or would you like to vote for Woody and what have you, it's going to be very cut and fast. But there are so many people who would be classified as rural who would never see themselves like that. That's absolutely clear. So I looked up stats department's data on people's occupation in the South Wairarapa. Now, it's true that they combine agriculture, forestry and fishing. It is the biggest single category, but it doesn't come to 1,000 people. It encompasses 963. And then when you come down and you look at particularly like construction, for example, and quite a few others, clearly those sort of occupational groups are going to go right across. They'll sometimes be in a town or sometimes be across. But I think it's possibly a mistake to overestimate the number of people who are living on the outskirts of one of our towns as being in some way rural workers or in any way.
I've never said they're rural workers. I've never said they're rural workers. The services they get and the representation about those services. And if you're not connected to water and you don't live in the town boundary, you're rural.
You're rural.
You're rural. That's the definition of rural, not what you do or whether you farm.
It's the next door to
It's
you.
about the services you provide.
Yeah, but we're also meant to be providing to communities of interest.
Yeah, so very much, and this is, there's a couple of things I just want to also raise here. Firstly, and this is a positive and a negative, anyone can stand for a rural ward. Anyone can stand for any ward. So you do not need to be a farmer or consider yourself a rural person to stand in a rural ward. Also, you don't necessarily need to be from Martinborough to stand in the Martinborough ward. They are quite different things.
Colin's a prime example.
Yeah, so
He's
Let's use Colin again.
Right down.
Let's use Colin again.
He's a river user.
Sorry, Nikki, sort of moving that on, do we run the risk if we introduce a rural ward or perhaps three, that actually we might end up with a situation where we have wards that don't have candidates standing in them? Because actually that's quite a lot of pressure and responsibility to put on the rural community to fill those spaces. It is a risk, like we're not getting masses of rural candidates standing with the system we currently have. Would they suddenly stand just because they had a rural ward to stand in?
Yep.
Nikki, you said before that, candidates for rural wards don't have to live rurally.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's just under the legislation. Don't know if you wanted to add anything else there, Rob. It's just part of the way it is.
I want to run from here.
Yeah, we did.
like politicians, rather than all.
Do you have to be a ratepayer in that area though?
No,
No, the people who nominate you have to.
Nominate you do,
yeah, so
sorry, yes.
as long as Rob had two nominees from Christchurch nominate him.
Yeah,
I'll nominate
I've actually had a few farmers say to me, they've talked about this rural ward thing, and they've said they're more than happy to nominate someone from Wellington if they think they're the right person for the job.
Yeah.
So they're not,
Do that.
They don't specifically say
they need a farmer, they just want someone that's
They
gonna
got to get the vote though.
their rights and
stand up for them.
They got to get the vote, Woody. If they nominate them, that's absolutely fine, but they've still got to get that candidate over them.
Good point.
As you could also, there is work that you can do to support farmers to stand at large. So the other side of that is if you had some councillors standing at large, then, you know, there could be some work to see if we could get representation in that way as well. So just, it works both ways for that.
So now, isn't there, if only one rural person stands, or stands against them,
Yeah.
they just get in, right? So, you know,
What's happened with community boards
this
is.
is, same thing with us. So it feels slightly undemocratic actually, that you just can't get appointed rather than.
that's why, yeah, that's where at large does actually help. Like if we had a couple of at large.
Look at that, it's like.
And the town wards do that.
And they nearly did for us, right?
It's no different.
It's the great.
Alistair, you just tell Tora to run at large.
I don't need a question.
So in the previous,
Tell Jenny.
in the previous triennium for a number of years, we did have GP who was representing
Absolutely.
the rural and specifically the coast down at Narwee and he was certainly seen as, well, he
Rural.
was a Martin Borough Ward councillor, he was seen by residents and ratepayers across the district as rural.
So, I mean, that rural meeting that you and I went to, Al,
Hi, Diane.
hotel,
You have that kind of
there were people at that who'd driven
Yes.
Kahuna and Tutramori that had come to that.
woody as well.
They do travel around for it, you know?
Yeah,
Sorry, boss.
So just so the rural meeting that Alice and I had in Woodside, we were doing the EAP consultations. And then the farmers that turned up that who'd driven from Kahuna and Tutramori to attend that, they will get around.
Farmers get engaged.
They get engaged, yeah.
If they're going to get representation.
Yes,
That's why they don't. Yeah, because they don't feel like they've been listened to.
yeah, so it is very much about representation and it is about our communities of interest. And I just wanted to also raise here, we have a number of communities of interest, of which rural and farming is one of them. We also have youth and aged, and I just would like you to think about when was the last time some of those other communities of interest had representation at the table. It's about representation and we just need to see the different ways that can happen.
what's she trying to say?
So
I haven't let my son vote.
I'm aged.
Are you talking about voters or candidates?
So for example, we've had federated farmers submit to the enhanced annual plan this year. They also submitted and spoke to the rating review. Just have a think about what other communities of interest exist within our boundaries of our district and whether or not they currently come to council with a voice. Because those are the communities of interest that we also need to be really interested in.
Disabled people, LGBT.
Yeah. Yeah.
everything, all the,
But there are, like, we do have a large rural community and we do need to make sure we're finding ways to represent them, but there are other communities of interest that we need to think about. And you could argue, whether you'd win the argument or not, it remains to be seen, you could argue that, you know, that our rural community in various ways have a strong voice into this table through various mechanisms. Do others have that same voice?
Can I just make a note real quick as well? I think that comes down to engagement too. And the fact that really,
Yep.
we put this out for quite a while. And I don't know whether or not we just didn't push it hard enough or what happened. But the other thing is as well, we need to look, if we're thinking about youth, if we're thinking about, are more vulnerable and things like, where do they go? I mean, did we set up at the rugby club?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, did we go down to the rugby club, set up and give them the submissions? Because there, you're automatically hitting youth, you're automatically hitting some of the, because every single one within our community has an Old Timers Day. And the Old Timers Day happened while this was running. So we could have actually, I'm just.
yeah, I know, but also.
But
hear a lot of people saying, is this something else you're asking us about? Because we also asked them to comment on the EAP. It was like, there's like a good thing I think we would ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, like,
We're like going,
fine then.
I've got submitters fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, but it's kind of like sometimes it's like to expect to just for them to pick up from what we've got on our webpage. Or,
Absolutely.
and also, like when this went out, like, did it go out in mail form at all?
No, it was very much an informal engagement and we are definitely on a journey to increase that.
Because if you're wanting to hear from the elderly, I mean, like the customer survey went out with a thing that they could scan, and I had 2 people in their 80s that don't even own cell phones, so they couldn't fill in the survey. Okay, so I mean, that's how we need to be thinking, because there are still those ones that it's not going to fit, and they would like to have their say, but they couldn't. So, they felt really quite upset about it. So,
45 or 34. That's.
Well, I don't know these,
but youth and that we've got.
the engagement with it in this way is important. But I still say the best engagement you can have is getting out there and talking to people, because you get a truer representation every time.
Yeah, it was unofficial.
Yeah,
That's an official thing, the way that we.
Yeah. but it's still,
You
it
can't just have spoke to 5 people and they said yes, it's like.
Yeah.
is, because it's a truer representation. You
Yeah,
get
but we
far
can't
more-
actually-
far more
Was that-
work every day.
That 5%, the 5 people you spoke to, is that 5? How many you spoke to?
Yeah.
How does Nikki factor that?
Yeah, I know they can't, but for us thinking about it, like, we can't just look at this and think about this.
I mean, it's a good indicator of where things are at. What their common
Yeah.
question is.
But I mean, it's,
I think us as councillors have got a real responsibility here to try and improve that,
Yeah,
the number of
get out.
answers to that. And I think we've
And I
left
think that comes,
this too much to staff to try and do.
yeah.
I think we've really got to round up all the people we know, and so you've got to put your voice in, really, we've got to put a lot of work into that.
Having 3 councillors say for each ward, is that clearly I'm getting different messages from the people I talk to than you are, and different from
Yeah.
Alice, right?
Yeah.
It becomes, a 2-dimensional process rather than 3-dimensional process. Then you're not really getting a true and accurate representation of like, what is the representation of this ward want?
Yeah.
They go, well, he's been speaking to all these people, this is what they said. It's like, well, they're different from the ones I'm speaking to. I think that's not what it's saying.
No disrespect to what you said about other people, other parts of our community, but they can be represented, our aged and our infirm and all we try and represent those people anyway. The thing is that people who live in our rural community, whether they're farmers or whatever, who don't get all the services, that makes up a third of our population. And right now, they don't have any specific say. The 2/3 of our community who live in the urban environment effectively dominate. Like when we stand for election, it's so hard to actually do the around the rural area. It's so vast. I got elected. I got elected to go to Drywell, but I got elected and go in Drywell. But hang on, you're missing my point. I got elected because I went and knocked on every door in Greytown. where there's
So urban,
voters.
saying so you went urban.
To, I could spend a week out around the community and I wouldn't even cover everybody. Whereas I could cover the whole of Greytown, you know, and that's the point about representation. It's really hard to deal with it. And farmers react in a, you know, farmers do, Aidan will tell you, you know, they sit around in the woolshed and they'll talk, you know, farmers will go at different times of the year when they get together. That's when they do all that sort of corresponding amongst themselves because they work in a, you know, work in a different way.
I don't disagree that that we shouldn't have rural representation, but I don't think it's fair to say that
I don't have any here.
they don't have any, because when I think about the candidates that stood for this election, certainly in Featherston, we didn't have 1/3 of the candidates standing that were rural, that live rurally. I can't think of any that lived in Greytown that were specifically rural based either. So to have the level of representation that they should rightly have, they have to stand.
Next year.
But they have to stand. But then you would argue that actually Greytown has, well, actually Greytown has 2/3 of its representatives who live.
Rurally.
So are we?
To get elected, we have to go and ask the urban people.
But are we trying to,
That's reality.
trying to solve the right problem?
Yeah.
Like, is the rural ward going to solve the right problem? Because to have rural wards, you have to have rural folk stand in those wards. We've already, you know.
Yeah.
I'm just
And
not.
Woody and I would, but we don't. So for us to represent the rural community,
We do
we had to
represent.
we had to be asked by the urban to represent them.
Aidan,
I
and
just don't understand
and then I'm going to keep going because I'm aware that at 12:30 Stephen will join us, and these will be good conversations to have with Stephen as well.
Yeah.
So Aidan.
I'd just like to, well, I suppose I've got plenty to say, but I won't say it all. I'd just like to go back and think, you know, for us all to reflect on who actually comes and consults with us, talks to us in public participation, sends emails, who turns up to community meetings out at Kora and Tar White when we do have those meetings. And I know that we haven't had a huge number. We've had some down at Nawi at the hall down there. We haven't had any at Puranaka, but we certainly get plenty of feedback from rural folks, whether it's a Tim Headley, whether it's a Dan Riddiford, whether it's Ben and Georgie Lutchins from out that way, whether it's Derek Daniels, who's got half ownership of White Rock Station. So we do get rural representation.
Absolutely.
Sorry, rural
Feedback.
but I also have had plenty of conversations prior to me standing at the last training and even while I was on the community board, trying to talk rural folks, farmers, to put their hand up for nomination to either come on council or come on community board. And there's a hell of a lot of people out there who are busy doing their own thing, as we're all busy doing our own thing. So I think, in my view, I think we've got the representation. I just don't know, while it would be, and Nikki has just said before that for a rural ward, we can't specify that someone standing in a rural ward, in fact, has to live rural.
Yeah.
So is that by having a rural ward going to solve any problems? There's no, there's no surety that having a rural ward, we're actually going to have anyone standing for it who live rurally.
I feel like it's virtue signaling.
And this is where at large helps.
Thank you. I mean, actually, this, because I think it highlights again, Pip's comment. We're not particularly sure what we even seem to agree on by rural. If I look around here, I think there are 4 councillors who live rural. Melissa thinks there were none who stood at Featherston. Who I think there were 2 council candidates. Who
Yeah, actually, no, you're.
If I recall, I mean, sometimes you can't be 100% certain. I mean, Woody is, I think, the most sort of on the margin, but I think you're rural.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I mean, I
So do I live in the middle of nowhere.
More about, I mean, there are some constraints, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Stephen says about communities of interest. Now, we all belong in many communities, but you know, we belong to geographic, possibly our spiritual, age group, music we like, etc. that there is a limit practically to how many of those things you can vote for in a way. And obviously over eons, most communities interested in having. Carterton did have a rural ward and then got rid of it.
Marston did. Sure, Marston had a rural ward.
It happens, it comes and it goes. However, I do think there is a community being interested in this. I think there's definitely a collection of people there who are, shall we say, noticeably not associated with
Council?
any of them. I think, on the other hand, many of the people who make wine, vineyards, etc., strictly speaking, rural, many of them, but they associate very closely with Martinborough, etc., etc. So it's, I mean, it is a judgment call, I think, and I mean, if there were enough people at the coast, and that encompasses not just agricultural people, incidentally, it encompasses holiday makers. I mean, you've got Lake Ferry, which is like the holiday, you've got Naui, which is fishing, etc. You've got forestry, you've got conservation, you've got quite a number of other sub-interests. But definitely, I think there is a sort of a distinction there you start to get to around about the time you get to, I don't know, sort of Kuranawa or whatever.
Yeah, Aidan, I'm going to move on to the community boards.
Oh, I'd like to hear, hey.
So just going on from, you know, Marston, you made a comment that Carlton did have a rural ward and got rid of them, and Marston certainly had rural wards and got rid of them. Both those councils have got rural advisory groups who are farmers from rural who are nominated by their community and have an advisory group which shares information and sends it up to the council table. So I'm wondering, rather than having a rural ward per se, and I'm
yeah, hold that thought. Yeah, because it's perfect timing to segue and something else. Perfect timing. But before I do, I just want to be really clear that for a rural ward to be established, there is quite a lot of work that will need to happen behind the scenes over the next month. We would need to work, we'd need to get some GIS assistance for mesh blocks. We would need to work with stats in regards to the population data down to the road level. That potentially will change the outcome of what you think. So there will be a lot of work involved in rural wards, and you'd need to be aware that things could change because of the representation must fall within the 10%. So I just want to be clear that it's at large, we can talk about, and it will predominantly remain the same, but a rural ward is a lot of work and subject to change.
So if we had two at large, like I'm just thinking if we keep the numbers the same and you go 2, 2, 2 and then Māori ward and then 2. So if you ended up with 2 at large, there's nothing stopping any, like when we say that we have heard the voice of the rural people, which is why we've gone to having 2 at large. And then it's like, it's up to them, because then anyone can apply for that the same as they can with the rural ward, but we're giving them a nod that we heard them. And so, you know, it's all about how we kind of engage. So
we're going to move into this. So I just wanted to give a wee summary of what we've talked about so far. So currently we have got Māori wards. We've got 1 Māori ward for 2025. We currently have 9 elected councillors through the 3 wards, and there is some discussion there if you wanted to change that, reduce it or stay the same. I have heard that potentially a reduction would be an increase in workload here today. So potentially the feedback that I have received so far from the table is that you quite like sitting around 9, but just have a think about that over the next week. Have a think about 3 councillors per ward, whether you want to reduce that, stay the same. At large, there has been some conversation around maybe adding 1 or 2 at large, so have a think about that over the next week. And the rural ward option, whether we add that in as an option for you to consider next week, is what I'd like to kind of end after we've talked to Stephen. But I just want to move on to community boards. So we had 48 people answer the online question, should we have community boards, noting that most of those who responded came from the Martinborough ward, and that we did have 5 current community board members answer that question as well. So we have had some support for community boards, and once again, I'd recommend that you read the comments in the survey that went out, because there were a few extra comments there around community boards. Definitely, we have people who support them and we have people who do not support them.
Even taking the 5 away, that's still 26 said yes, or that aren't currently on community boards. So I mean, that's still a much higher. That's still much higher than the 14 that said no.
Yep. So one of the things I've been talking to Stephen Hill about, and is if you wanted to make a change for community boards, my recommendation would be to make that change in the initial proposal, so that we can go out for consultation on that using the special consultative procedure. If community boards, if you would like to change and remove them, then the community boards, you would need to explain the rationale for this decision. And once again, a reminder, this is about representation. So this is about understanding what groups those community boards represent, and do they currently have representation through another way. So we're coming to community boards, also coming to council. If community boards are removed, we would need to indicate how we still provide for effective representation. And this is where a rural advisory board may come in. So we would need to think about representation through different areas of our community and participatory democracy, excuse me. So this is something that we could consider as well as part of the representation review. Thirdly, if we changed community boards and we went out for consultation, and that consultation came back very much in support of community boards, then you would really need to make that a large part of your deliberations and look to include them back in. So this is about understanding how our community feels represented and the options that they would like to have. Did you want to add anything else in here, Rob?
Just to mention the statistic before, that there seems to be general support for decision making. Just back to, I think might have been the CE's comment there, roles and responsibilities, you know, in terms of what the council decisions make versus what the local community board's decision make. Maybe that's something that we investigate and see how to enhance or support boards so that it's not actually that in the decision making. So it's just something outside of this conversation that maybe some.
Yeah. I'm not running the show, but I am.
It's like,
I was going to say that.
Yeah, sorry. Having served on 2 community boards over my term and as a council appointee, I've always felt that the view of the community boards within the community is that sort of representative role model that report back to council and feed on the information. It's never ever actually functioned that way, unfortunately. In fact, we found community boards to be quite adversarial at times and really difficult to manage when it becomes you know, certainly a subject that's quite contentious. I've been of the view that you've got to look at community boards from the current position of having little say or perhaps not as structured as they possibly could be in terms of what we see, our observation. So you've either got to boost their responsibilities and their power in terms of what they do currently, or get rid of them completely. And unless you're prepared to make that commitment, it'll just be the same as it is now for generations to come. So,
yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to repeat something I have said quite some time ago. I think part of the problem that we need to address with anything we do when we go out to consultation is to avoid somehow the implication that what we're offering has no cost. And I think, for example, it doesn't matter whether we have fewer councillors, for example, there are potentially some cost consequences. But I don't think very great. But I think in the case of community boards, I think most people who will have answered the sort of formal consultation will not have seen their decision one way or the other as having any financial consequences. And therefore, in those circumstances, it's always easier to say yes than no.
Right.
And I'm aware, I did want to kind of pick up one point you made, which is if we get rid of community boards, we have to have something to replace them. I would want to debate that. Plenty of councils do community boards, and we have a lot of parallel structures to community boards, and we wouldn't have to either. But what I thought was the neatest arrangement of those councils have basically said to communities, we're prepared to, we don't do it already, you can have a community board, but if you do, it brings this amount of targeted rates every quarter or whatever, so that if there was one Featherstone, they agree with Colin, they don't see the point, then they don't pay the targeted rate. If Greytown desperately keen to do it, well, then it's another few dollars every time they get a bill.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to actually put it back on the voters, the people being consulted, might encourage a few more to take an interest even, that this is not cost free. Magic up somewhere. If you want it, you have to be prepared, willing to pay for the
Yeah, so this is a topic that's come up in quite a lot of discussions around a number of councils. And because this is representation, we need to be very careful that it's not related to cost. So when we go out for consultation, it is purely around how do you feel you get your voice heard at council. And even though there is an implication for cost, that can't be the deciding factor. It really has to be those avenues that our communities of interest find the best to make their voice.
Are you saying that those councils who did just what I'm proposing and went to their communities and said, are you prepared to pay for it, that somehow they're acting illegally? Because I agree with that.
Side of this type of review, though, I imagine.
Possibly. So the advice I've been given by the commission is that doesn't really fall within the representation review, as the representation review is about how do you feel you get your voice heard. There can't be an element of cost in that.
I think everything's got an element of cost in it, and we need
It does.
people need to know what they're voting for. Exactly.
Can we be clear though, that the cost for paid to councillors, no matter how many we have, is determined by the remuneration authority, not by us? So they determine the pool of funds we have to make available to pay, and they determine, I think, the mayor's salary out of that, and then everything else is a pool. So it cannot be linked to cost because we have no control over the pool that we're given.
Yeah, but there's all your time and all your staff's time and all the extra time that goes into it, you know.
That's part and parcel of what we have to do to be legislative compliance with the representation review requirements.
Yeah, but people need to understand what that cost is. Otherwise, I might say, let's have 50 people representing us. And they'll go, well, actually, that we can't afford. Yeah, but they won't if they know what it costs.
But the two things are not linked in that way.
Well, I've got to say, I would, if I'm asked a question, the first question I'm going to say is, what is it going to cost me?
But we couldn't even necessarily answer that question because we don't set the pool.
Oh,
No, but it's not just the pool. There's only $9,000 a year or whatever it is for community boards. It's bugger all.
We do that we are legally required to do. And we don't do that for any of those. So why would we do it for the rep review?
But we know it costs about $100,000 a year to run community boards.
In what way?
All the staff time, staff hours and hours that go into having to go to reports and sit in meetings and so on and so forth. There's no.
Where has that been quantified?
because it's part of their role, right? So that's some part of
Part of it is
like that's cool, but that's actually part of their role, like officers. So I mean, Janice has got that.
It's actually quantified on the community board's balance sheet. If we find someone who's quantified on the community board's balance sheet.
But again, it's about what question are we asking and what is the problem that we're trying to solve?
I think one of the,
Representation review is how does the
Good morning.
community have their issues, concerns, voice represented to the council based as a whole? What is the mechanisms they're using?
Why,
I would suggest that, sorry, but go for it.
can I just say, why can't we have a rural representative on the community boards? Why is that not an option to be able to look at having a rural representative on each of the community boards? And that way we have that engagement that feeds straight into the council.
I just don't think the community boards, I don't, think, you know, I don't see the value of them. I just, because they're adversarial, they don't actually benefit or help us at all. Well, they just see us as being the enemy and take us on all the time. I think Rob's point actually, Rob, sorry, mate. It's just like, I think governance is a huge issue with community boards. They don't actually understand fundamentally what their role is, what they should be drilling down into or not. I mean, you know, the line of what they are responsible for and what they want to do it's not just blurred. They've got no idea as to where it is, right? I mean, and what they actually benefit and that they gain. I would get more out of talking to the Greytown Little Theatre on a one-off than I would have them come to the community board and making a presentation. And I think in terms of that representation of those different groups in the community, as an independent body representing or having a chat with, let's say, someone like myself or Alistair or Woody, would be of greater benefit to them than having their 5 minutes of community board meeting once every 6 weeks.
Yep. Totally agree.
And I know, I'm just saying some community boards are fantastic and they're great, but other ones, you're just sitting there going, fuck, I'll be lucky if I get out of here alive.
Yeah, and that's what Alistair found last training.
I was going to ask though of that, and I guess I'm playing devil's advocate as well, is that the fault of the community board as a structure, or is there a need to strengthen and define what it is the role?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Currently, all three understand their role and their purpose and their place quite differently. And that falls back to what information are they, you know, when we were inducted as councillors, there was a very robust induction of what is, you know, what does it mean to be a councillor? What's your role? What do you do? Can we hand on heart say that the community board members got as robust induction and therefore clearly understand how to do their role or what their role is?
I agree. We actually, as a community board, great, and we've asked Nikki for help to come talk to us about governance. So the community board can actually understand what its role actually is, because I agree. I think that was made clear as to where they. Sorry.
Sorry, no, thank you, Nikki. Let's talk after you.
You know, they were given that support of that training. I mean, you know, there's only so many times you can go on these meetings and talk about fucking wine barrels down Main Street.
No, there's not. We can keep going for another 3 years.
I mean, there's other things. All I.
This is an open forum.
Sorry.
Yes.
Council.
No, I was just pointing at you. Yeah.
Just something to consider in this representation review. So what is the outcomes you're trying to achieve? So just think about when the election happens next year and, you know, the council's sort of retired for its month or whatever it is, and you're off campaign. Will this representation review that you're doing right now increase participation? Will more people stand to be elected? And will you have a better outcome in representing views at the table and within those communities? So I think that's the broader question you have to ask yourself is the decision we make today, will it be better off? Will more people want to run? Will more people participate? Because they know that if they stand for, say, a community board or they stand for council, that they'll be able to participate or make a decision that will make a difference. So I think that's something that you should be thinking about, you know, when it comes to some sort of decisions you're going to make today. And I think the Electoral Commission will talk about that too, hopefully, fingers crossed. So that's something to think about. Do I want to change something today knowing that tomorrow we will get a better outcome for those communities? The other thing is that the map that we had before, just another question I think about, is communities of interest. So there was a point made in the councillors that you don't want to sort of squish your awards too closely because may get less participation. I think the idea was trying to grab more participation. So this is something to consider, is that you want to be more inclusive than less inclusive. And then the other question you want to ask is, if you think that there's not representation around this table, there hasn't been in the past, then you might consider other communities of interest that you think need to be represented on it. So I think those are probably the three big questions you want to ask yourself, and those are the big brave moves, bold moves that you want to make because you think you can get a better outcome for the community next year.
So can you have a rural community?
I just wanted to add to that, what I'm hearing is, I'm wondering how much of what I'm hearing is about consultation and engagement with the community versus representation at the table. Because there's other ways for groups to have their voice heard without having, without changing this. If I'm not wedded to one thing or the other, it could be what it'll be. But I'm hearing a lot of stuff around engaging with the communities and letting them have their say, similar to what we did with the enhanced annual plan. Is that the thing you're trying to fix?
Exactly. Can I capture that for a moment? Because one of the things that's important is that we are the decision makers. Around this table, we are the decision makers. So when we make our decision, we're actually trying to gather as much information from our communities as possible. Now, we're not getting a lot of that from our community boards. We're getting it from our own sources within our communities, representation groups or whatever. Ultimately, we are the decision makers, and so whatever we capture from our community, then we make a decision based on the information that's fed to us. So I agree with you. I totally agree. These representation groups within our communities would probably provide more of a source of information.
I agree with you, but can I just put something out there? I did maths, and my maths might be slightly outside, but what it works out at, given the number of representatives we have in our community, whether it be community board or councillors, we have one elected person per 409 people. Now, if you take that across the country, we would have a parliament of 6,112 people. That's the reality of what we're talking about here. It's ludicrous. We are so overrepresented.
Yeah.
Is it including community boards?
Yeah.
Yes. 409 people per elected
We've got
person.
6 community board members per ward.
Oh, sorry, I stood on the line.
So that's 6. There's 18 extra.
9,000 people.
Well, if you take out the 2 council members on each
Yes,
month,
it's just
it's 4, so it's 12,
I did.
right?
Yes, I did.
So 12 extra.
Plus our 9.
Yeah.
Okay, we go.
22
21.
by 9,000 people, 409.
I certainly take on board, the difficulties with community boards, and I mean, I struggle with some members of the Martin Borough Community Board at the moment. However, the feedback that I get from in spite of that, having said that, in spite of that, the feedback that I get from the community board members, from the members of the community that they speak to in the community, going around doing their own thing, and then the feedback that comes up to me, while I might not agree with everything that comes up, it's still feedback and it's still information which helps me form the decisions around this table.
Yeah.
I think it takes the rural advisory group for Martin Borough, where it's coming from, like.
So it's not.
No, but it's not just them.
The real folks, I mean, that's another aspect, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. But the community board that has their meetings in this room, they've got their own network and their own groups and within the community, within the whole community, rural as well as urban. And there's no way that myself as a councillor would be able to tap all those individual people within the Martin Borough ward, both urban and rural. So from my perspective, I mean, while they can be difficult to deal with at times, the information and the value that they provide to me is beneficial.
But why couldn't that be done through a resident ratepayers association? Why does it have to be a formal structure of a community board? Resident ratepayers association work extremely well in council and providing information back to council. So I guess that's the question: is that do they need to have
I think the concept of a community board is a great one.
Yeah.
The problem is the people you end up on them, and around the table. Now that will vary from triennium to triennium, right? So you've got a great one right now. Who knows what's gonna happen next time around?
We had a great one
But-
previously.
But I actually, I completely back what Aidan's saying, you know, like, unfortunately, like, as we know, we don't get on with everybody all the time. But I want to try and explore having someone that, rather than a necessary rural advisory group, because as well, like, why don't we look at having rural representation through there, at that level, at the community board level? I mean, why can't we have someone who is a rural rep on the community board? You know, why can't we put it out there? It would be the same as putting out for a rural rep, but you know, you may not have someone that actually lives rurally. But so for example, I live in the middle of town, but my father was a shearing contractor. You know what I mean? Like everyone, like the majority of the farms all around here, they don't think of me as urban.
Why can't they give it to you?
Yeah. Haven't?
Correct.
No,
They can run to the
but they will sometimes, but what I'm saying, and I sit here. But and Aidan sits here, you sit here, Woody sits here. And that's why I think, you know, but we're hearing that they don't feel they have a voice still at the table. And so why don't we look at putting a rural,
If they could run,
the community board?
they can run for the community board now, and they're not.
Yeah. Well, take him up for the council and they're gone.
Excell's got, you know, like, three of the members that are on there were appointed because no one else ran. Neil's the only one that ran and got voted in.
And the same last triennium.
Who's
And the same at Featherston. Featherston had 2 elections last time, Morris
At the
this time.
community board.
You know, Martin, Greytown had 2 elections for community board last time and 2 this time.
I'm gonna,
They're not valued.
yeah, I'm gonna take this conversation back to when Stephen comes to
Yes.
mind, and I'm just.
Sorry,
Up.
you don't find that here. And I've always said that to you, haven't I? Like the whole time, like right from when it was adversarial and so.
So I just want to be crystal clear what I'm keen to get out of today. I would really love to, there's paper coming to the strategic working committee next week, and I would love to provide you with 2 to 3 options that will be tabled on that day. There'll be a paper going that's very similar to some of the information we've heard about today. This is where I am at and keen for some direction from you all. So option 1 is status quo. So that could be an option that we put on the table next week, which is where we sit right now with the Māori ward is added on. Option 2 is basically.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, it's
Totally. I see it.
similar to the options we've been playing around, and I've bolded the numbers because you could, you know, change them around if you wanted to. And whether or not you wanted to include a 3rd option next week, whether you would like that on the table for discussion next week. And this is taking on board the current boundaries, looking at rural, looking at large and community boards. So I'd really love to come away from today with a clear understanding of how many options you'd like.
Yeah, and I'll follow that up by saying that Janice and I had the pre-agenda meeting yesterday based on sort of the framework of this paper that currently exists without the recommendations. And as the chair, the request I made of Janice was to have some really clear recommendations to guide that conversation, because otherwise we are going to be having a conversation very much like this for what I imagine will be several hours, trying to cover off a vast number of points, including size of council, whether or not there's community boards, rural boards, boundaries, at large, all sorts of things. We need to give direction today on some recommendations and directions so that that conversation next week is still open, it's still robust, but it's got some framework around it to help us move to where we need to get.
I'd like to see my option for rural included in there. And look, if you don't want it, that's what the people that can go out and they can say, no, we don't want it.
Can we just,
That's an
no.
Whatever option, you're putting one option out for consultation, you're not putting a number of options out. The legislation says you have to come to a decision about what option you want to talk to the
One option by the 31st of July. So next week, we will ask you for your preferred option, option 1, 2 or 3. We will do work during July on that option, and then we will come to you at the Strategic Working Committee on the 31st of July, and we will ask you to adopt that option and the consultation document to go out.
So this
So
isn't
what-
like the enhanced annual plan where you get, choose option 1, 2 or 3. This is not like that.
So what happens if we put out one option and vast majority of people say, no, don't like it?
Then we stick with the other one, whichever one they do like.
What happens is if we put it out and people give feedback, then if we get submissions, we can choose to tweak the proposal, which then goes to the commissioner.
So you
If we get no feedback, then it just gets moved forward.
Absolutely. So if we go out for consultation on one option and we're looking at consultation 5 August to 8 September. If we run that and no one submits to that consultation, we're done. That's it. That's your status quo. That's what's happening for 2025 and 2028. If we are during that consultation process, we will have some people submit to that option in support or maybe not in support. We will run hearings and deliberations. It is very important because of the representation review that you take on board everybody's views. And if we do not support their views for representation, we have some clearly defined way. So if everyone comes back to us and said, look, we would just love a rural ward, then we have to really seriously think about adding in a rural ward or give reasons why we may think that there'd be another form of representation that could support that community of interest. And then following the deliberations, I'm coming to you in a minute, following the deliberations on the 2nd of October, we then put out notification and our community has an option to once again submit to us any concerns or complaints that they have on this representation, and those go through to the Commissioner. The Commissioner makes the final decision in April of 2025.
I'll start the ball rolling by, my proposal for option 3 would be status quo with the Rural Advisory Group.
So it's what's a no at large.
Status quo with a Rural Advisory Group.
Yeah, I'd second that.
Sorry, is that for option, as a option? Yeah, option.
Option 3, because it's blank at the moment.
Yeah.
So you're talking about 3 for each ward plus Murray ward.
And
Plus-
advisory group.
But a rural advisory board isn't a paid elected position, no.
Oh, okay.
Nominated, independent.
Yeah.
Or get rid of your community boards and have a rural advisory board instead.
The option 2 doesn't give you that option. If you're going to revert back to 2 councillors for each ward, we haven't discussed the future of community boards. Do we feel that 2 councillors without community boards would be sufficient representation?
No.
3 councillors without.
No.
So that's a difficult one because you've only shown that as option 2. But that's still inclusive of community boards?
Yeah, well, option 1, your direction is what we're keen for. So option 1 could include community boards and option 2 could not include community boards, or we do option 1 with community boards and option 3 is without community boards.
There's a risk if you remove 1 councillor from a ward and decide at the end of the day to remove community boards and just set up advisory groups, then there is a degree of underrepresentation for the population. My strong recommendation is we looked at an option for our ward system. We retain three elected representatives. I like the idea of having one advisory group in terms of rural advisory group. We may have another couple of advisory groups, obviously the Maori ward as well, but without community boards.
So the advisory groups would replace the community boards.
Pretty much, yep.
The only thing with that is that when you look at some of the comments for those who were in favour of at large, they weren't necessarily in favour of at large purely for rural representation. They were in favour of at large for a more district-wide view at the council table, a more a view that wasn't just based in which ward you came from or which town you lived in. So the at-large addresses a very different issue than a rural advisory board will perhaps.
But
But the advisory committee can happen at quite independent of any.
It can.
Oh, absolutely.
It can be added on to. I can't imagine that we're allowed to go consulting on that, is it?
Well, we could indicate, that we would look to, but we're looking at using some other ways to collect representation, maybe around the advisory groups.
Through the mayor, I don't think you need to consult on it. That's an advisory group you'd like to sit on. Like that, and there's a function of the council.
I've shared some information from Marsden District Council on the formation of their advisory group to everyone around this table. So some information there. There was 2 elected members. One's the chair, 6 positions, 2 EV, 4 publicly run expressions of interest from rural communities here.
Sorry, I mean, Stephen Hill's just online. Yeah, Stephen, we're quite keen, we've got a couple of questions we're quite keen to put your way if you're here.
Yep, certainly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Great, good to be able to join you, thanks.
So I will summarise. Please feel free to jump in and tweak my summary at any stage, councillors and mayor. We've had quite a discussion this morning in regards to rural wards and at large and also community boards. So some of the questions that have come up are around rural representation and the options we've got for those boundary lines. So I'm quite keen to get some input from you around that. Also just around options that we've got for rural representation if it wasn't a ward. Very keen to get some input for you on community boards, and if we remove them, what would we need to be mindful of? And how would we need to kind of work that through the consultation process? Anything else that I've missed out there? No. The floor is yours, Stephen.
Okay. So I think the first thing you were asking about was the rural wards and options. So what in particular has sort of been the focus of the discussion?
So we were looking at, you'll love my new little map there.
Yeah, that's great. Yep.
We talked last week in regards to boundary lines about reducing Martinborough, Greytown and Featherston and then rural sitting around that.
Yep.
Do we have other options for splitting the rural ward in other ways? Did you want to comment on this, Councillor Plummer, in regards to your ideas around having a rural representative each of the ward?
Our current ward structure, we've got 3 defined wards and ballpark figure, there's 3,000 voters in each ward as it currently stands. 2,000 live in our urban environment and get the urban services, 1,000 roughly in each ward in a rural environment. Why can we not go, let's keep the same boundaries we've got, but say 2 councillors must be from within an urban ward or urban structure, 1 rural.
Yep, good question. And unfortunately, the legislation, if I'm understanding the suggestion correctly, doesn't allow for that. Once you have defined a ward boundary, for example, the boundaries that are there now, the legislation is such that a person can stand you know,
No,
any
I
person
think
can
you're missing, I
stand
think you're
within
missing
that
it.
ward.
What I was trying to say is you create within, so if you take the Martin Borough ward, you would create 2 wards within that Martin Borough ward. One would be an urban, so you'd ring fence the town. And then the rest of the ward, as it currently stands, would be the urban component of it. So you'd actually have 2 wards in there,
So you'd have an urban ward.
an urban ward and a rural ward.
So yeah, you'd have 6 wards all up,
So you'd end up with 6 wards.
plus the Māori wards, 7 wards.
So 7 wards.
Okay, that's certainly possible, but we'd have to look at how the population figures would sit and what that would mean in terms of representation and the number of population per elected member. That's that plus or minus 10% rule that you'll be aware of. So certainly some work could be done around that. You can't have wards within wards, but you can, split an area into separate wards and create additional wards if you thought that was an option to provide for that rural voice to be more effectively represented.
Stephen, quick question. I think ultimately the problem we're trying to solve is increased representation for our rural community.
Yep.
Could you give an indication of, I guess, the pros and cons of a rural ward versus introducing at-large voting?
Yep, sure. At-large voting obviously is, as it says, gives electors the opportunity to vote for candidates across the whole of the district. So there are some potential, pluses and minuses with at large. One of them being that you can't guarantee where candidates will stand from, and in an at-large situation, you may find that there's a predominance of candidates standing from a particular area and possibly from urban centres. So by creating rural wards, if you can define rural areas, you do give yourself the opportunity for a greater likelihood that rural voice will be represented, because candidates are more likely, it's not guaranteed, but they are much more likely to be standing from within that area, and so have a more direct connection to the community of interest, which is the thing that you're trying to create. So yeah, at large works more if there are not distinct communities of interest, and I guess the question for you is, if there are distinct rural communities of interest whose interests and concerns and the way that they interact with the district are different from those of the urban folk, then you might indeed be wanting to look at a more targeted representation for that community of interest.
Thank you. Quick follow-up question. The map on screen indicates 1 rural ward. Councillor Pulamatu, who spoke just before me, is suggesting a rural ward that sits in each Greytown, Featherston and Martin Borough, so the introduction of 3 rural wards. Do we run the risk, in your experience, of almost overwhelming that community of interest? It seems to me that needing 3 representatives and therefore for 3 pools of candidates in such a small community, because each would only have potentially 1,000 people, could potentially become an unintended burden.
Yep. That is certainly a possibility. Again, it's hard to speculate as to what that impact might be, but you are drawing on, I guess, a smaller population of rural communities to populate 3 wards, and that is that could be a burden. And again, we haven't yet done the numbers as to what that might mean in terms of the number of councillors. Can I just make an observation? And I guess perhaps looking at that map and thinking of what some other councils have done, would there be some consideration to creating 2 rural wards one that encompasses the Martinborough area and one that encompasses the Featherston Greytown area, and that could be effectively in, if you like, a west and an east rural ward, so an east rural and a west rural ward. That could be another option, again, depending on how the numbers fall, that you might want to consider, rather than splitting it further into the three categories.
Then you'd be Featherston Greytown, which fits you perfectly.
Stephen,
Sorry, you go.
Stephen, just a question, out of, I don't know, can't remember how many councils, provincial and rural councils there are in New Zealand, how many currently are running rural wards?
Oh, look, I haven't got those numbers in front of me, but quite a number. They're not always called a rural ward, but there are certainly quite a significant number of councils that have wards that are based around urban areas and wards that are based on rural areas. They might not necessarily be called ABC rural ward, but their character is more rural, and that's very common quite widely across the country.
Thanks.
Stephen, what about other forms of representation for rural communities?
So council has a number of options that it can look at. There are some councils that have a specifically rural community board, and that's one option that can work well. Other councils use mechanisms such as a rural advisory group, which can, depending on the nature of the relationship with the council, which can have input into council processes as well. So there is a range of options, but probably those are the two that we see most commonly, being the community boards, and which could be either known as a rural community board, or it represents an area that is predominantly rural, and then the advisory group or similar kind of panel is another one that committee that might be a useful mechanism that a number of councils use.
Stephen, can I just make an observation as well? Because you're talking to some of our people, so they are concerned about who that representative or what that representative would look like if we established a rural ward. So it's in the I guess that the will of the voter at the end of the day about who represents, and that person may not even be from our district. It may well be from outside the district. Whereas if we established a rural advisory group, that would be a group that's established from those rural communities to who they see as their representatives around the table. So there's more surety, I guess, from a representative point of view, of getting a good cross section of those people on an advisory group, rather than the reliance on an election to get the right people. That's my observation.
Yeah, and just to comment on that, I think that's a useful observation, and that's certainly been the experience that I've seen elsewhere. It gives you a mechanism that you can use for liaising with rural stakeholders, be that federated farmers or other rural community groups, and that's quite a helpful way of having them given some status for input into council processes.
Sorry, Stephen, I was just going to say, it's also a good way to kind of enhance, I guess, moving them through. And because it seems to be that, sometimes it's hard to get traction on people who live rurally. I mean, we've got so much technology now that actually the majority of them, even if they can't come here physically, could still be a part of our meetings. And I guess, slowly as we remove barriers, we may find that we'll just naturally progress having more people who live rurally who can actually be on council. But to me, a rural advisory group board sounds like a really good way just to start them with their understanding, build their knowledge, to actually get them engaged, which I think is really important too.
Yep. And your neighbours up the road at Carterton would be helpful to speak to in terms of their experience with a rural advisory group, which from my understanding has worked reasonably well for them.
Oh.
Just we've got you for 15 more minutes. Is there any other questions on rural wards, or can I move on to community boards?
Community board.
Cool, community boards. Stephen, can you just kind of give us a bit of a summary of if we were looking to change community boards, the options that we've got and kind of the best approach for that, given that there may be some community support?
Community support for?
Community boards. So there might be, there is, I think there is sentiment in our community at the moment for them and against them. And what's the best approach for us going forward? Any recommendations you'd make there?
I guess if where there's mixed views as to the pros and cons of community boards, then really you have to make a call as to whether you think there is a case. And I suppose the question to ask yourselves is who is missing out on representation currently, or who is not being as well represented as they might otherwise be. And I guess we're thinking, perhaps the rural community is one of those. And would a community board be a mechanism that could assist that? But there might be other geographical areas as well where you feel that there is a need for more enhanced connection with the council, more ability for a local or a community voice to be heard with the council. And that's the kind of case, I guess, you need to settle in your own minds to move down the path of proposing to set up community boards. So it's really about what's the need, and is this the best solution? Because as we've sort of discussed around advisory groups, there are other options that can be explored as well. But it's certainly one that you could give consideration to, and it would be interesting to see what the community feedback on if that was part of a proposal would be.
Can I ask a question here, Nikki? Because I think one of the main reasons that we have community boards is because we actually have to have an eye over the district as councillors. We although we've been voted on by our different wards, we're still meant to have an eye over the district. That is our role as the councillors. So therefore, the community boards come on to be able to be our grassroots level of our each town and or ward. Each ward is probably better. And I guess I have a little bit of a concern, hearing. I understand why people feel like they feel. I get it, but for me, I think I already know that in the last triennium, when something was tried against the Martinborough Community Board, they received a petition with over how many? Can you remember, Aidan? How many signatures there were? There was a couple of hundred signatures. So we're looking at this for the whole district. But when it came to the Martinborough Community Board, the overwhelming support for the Martinborough Community Board has always been there. So it's very tough. And I look at it like we're here representing the district at a council level because we cover the whole of the South Wairarapa. And so to then be asked to as well try and get down to be able to manage at that next level can sometimes be very, very trying, especially when you see how large the Martinborough ward is.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation, and certainly probably a view that's commonly held around a number of councils. That it's that kind of the eyes and ears of the council on the ground, and the ability to both feed information up the line to the council, but also to take information back to local communities, and that two-way function that community boards have is important. Keeping in mind that a lot of the success or otherwise of community boards comes down to, or part of it comes down to the delegations and the powers that you give to community boards, so that they actually do have a meaningful purpose and feel that they are achieving things on behalf of the council. And where that doesn't work as well, you do tend to have issues that can arise. And again, you've got the questions that you are, of course, at the mercy of the personalities, in the same way that is the case around the council table as well. So but all of those issues have to factor into your thinking about whether to retain, whether to remove community boards as an option for your arrangements.
Mm,
Can I possibly make a
very split.
out of the box kind of comment? I'm just wondering whether there might even be another option, and we talk about a rural advisory group, and the challenge of the current community board setup. Is an urban advisory group also an option as a different way of looking at the role of community boards for the future?
So it's I think the whole.
I guess it's not one that I've seen as in place in the past. I think usually that type of structure has been used for the rural issues because they're addressing, the particular concerns of rural communities being further distant from urban centres and the sense of disconnect that they have. But you've also got, I guess, residents associations, residents groups, those kinds of things, which can be a useful conduit for interaction and relationship with the council as well. And certainly most councils put a degree of effort into building good relationships with those agencies also.
I'm aware that we have been going since 11. So one of the things I wonder, Stephen, if you're okay just to hang around, it would be really good just to get feedback from each of you in regards to the options that you would like to see next week. If you feel there's anything missing, if you have a preference for anything in particular, I would be very, very keen just to go around the room. And if Stephen, you're okay just to give us jump in if there's anything that we need to be aware of that we can or can't do.
Sure.
The advice.
Nikki, can I just clarify that each member is going to say what the preferred option is?
Yeah.
What you want? Yeah.
Preferred option. Yeah. Or yeah. I guess, yeah, we've got next week to go through the strategic working committee, but just what else you'd like to see at that paper next week, what your preferred option would be. Okay, you have to run with it.
I'll kick it off, status quo, but with the rural advisory group covering the whole rural.
Community board?
Community board,
Community.
status quo with current councillor numbers,
Yeah.
current community boards and a rural advisory group.
Community boards and a rural advisory group. Thank you.
I haven't really got a preferred option at the moment, although I would like to keep the current number of councillors with a change of some sort to either rural or at large. And I did have one question. Can you do an urban at large and a rural at large rather than have wards?
They would, strictly speaking, they would not be at large because at large is the whole district. So you can't have rural and break up. But what you could have is a district-wide rural ward.
Yep.
But your urban wards would have to be geographically specific to the area that they represent. So effectively, that would have been the option that you were looking at in terms of retaining the smaller township-based wards and an urban, and a rural district-wide rural ward. But you can also have councillors elected at large in addition to those. That's the mixed model option as well. So you can have a certain number of councillors elected by ward, be that urban or rural, and a certain number of councillors elected at large. So that's the option for giving you the mix of at large representation alongside your urban and or rural wards.
Thanks, Steve.
I like option 2. Option 2 with community boards and looking at the rural advisory group.
Oh, thank you.
That's all. Sorry, Stephen, while you're there, just to clarify, and it was a point that came up earlier, there was a bit of debate around this. If the rural advisory, if we're suggesting either the status quo with a a rural advisory group or a change with a rural advisory group, does the rural advisory group form part of this presentation review, or can it be added at a later date?
Yeah, good question. I was going to make this comment as well. It's not formally part of this review because it's not a structure that's provided for in this legislation. But you can certainly in your proposal and in the report that comes to council, you can, as part of the wider information, signal that the council will investigate or explore the option of establishing a rural advisory group as part of the next term of the council, and that would be a signal that would be useful to give to the community, but it's not formally a part of this review.
Right. So my option would be two ward councillors selected within ward to give even representation, and one representative from each ward at large. Not if that's functional or not, but I'd have no community boards, but I'd have a rural advisory group, and certainly support the establishment and of a residents association. So that could obviously wouldn't be mandatory, but it could be a recommendation that we would. But that's removal of community boards. So 2 ward representatives, 1 at large from each ward, no community boards, rural advisory group, and promotion of a residents association.
So you want
just a quick comment. You can't have councillors from a ward elected at large. They have to be either elected from a ward or elected at large. So the at large is separate from the wards.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mean it's
thanks,
option
Stephen,
2.
yeah, and you're right. Okay.
Plus the Maori ward. So you want 3 at large plus the Maori ward.
So yeah,
Well, that's the kind of option
I forgot about the Maori ward because that would change the numbers of representatives around the table quite considerably. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just
Don't
trying
have to sit. You can have 11.
Yeah.
And we're not making decisions today.
I know, no, but you want some guidance you're going to consult on at the end of the day, or what you're going to get to.
It's like next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, could I just ask Stephen a question? I'm just struggling a little bit with the community aspect, Stephen. Would there be significant difference between a community advisory group and a residents association? Would in terms of community representation, would that?
You mean a community board as opposed to
No, instead of having, no. In terms of the community, then you're having, so like, we're looking at having a rural advisory group, right? Well, there's the option of a community advisory group too, presumably.
Instead of community board, yeah.
Yeah.
But that would be by statute. That would be something that the community would decide for themselves, I guess.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, from our point of view, would you see benefits between like a residents advisory, what did you call it, resident association or community advisory group in terms of which would be better for the community feedback?
Generally, residents associations are established by the community and are quite separate from council structures. Obviously, you want to build relationships with them, but the type of thing like a rural advisory group is probably something where the community, where the council works more in partnership with that part of the community to establish the group and to get it working well.
But not as much as they would with community board.
Correct. Yeah. Community board has more statutory.
So there would be this kind of overhead for the council to have it.
No overhead for residents.
No.
But
there'll be less overhead for the advisory group than there would be for the community board. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies, Nikki and councillors. I'm going to have to head off to another council now, and I'm happy to pick up questions offline through you, Nikki, later on and give as much clarity as we can.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. I think option 1 and option 2 are both good, plausible options that we can debate next week. I don't wish to add another one. At this stage, I could be probably equally happy with either, but let's hear let's focus on one or two options and then have a debate, and then that would clear my mind. Regarding community boards, I think it's a mistake to have a blanket rather than to have them all or not.
Yep.
I think what we've heard today suggests there are some parts of the district where maybe they don't work so well. I have them there. Other parts of the district where I think they are very, very, popular. So let's have them there. And as I say, I think if we can indicate in some way that there might be an element of targeted rate around that eventually, I think that'd be perfect.
Great, perfect, thank you.
I don't know that I necessarily have a preferred option at this point. I definitely want to see an option next week that includes an at-large element.
Yep.
I think we need to explore that. Whilst the pool of feedback was small, there seems to be an interest in it. So I think we need to look at that. I think I certainly don't hold any strong views at this point about the community board, or boards, but I wonder what the mechanism for discussion with the community is. Is it leaving them in as status quo, or is it taking them out, or is it suggesting that they come out? Like, if we want feedback from the community on that's wider than 50 people around whether they want them specifically for their town, how do we frame the proposal to trigger that conversation and feedback?
My advice would be, if you're going to make a substantial change, do it in your initial proposal, and then we collect a lot more feedback.
So are you suggesting that in the initial proposal we would propose to not have them?
Absolutely. So I would, that initial proposal, if you're looking to make substantial change, make it at that initial stage, and then we can go out for full consultation and engagement around that time. And obviously the community boards as well would contribute to that consultation process. And then you would have some very good discussion in the deliberation.
Do you think I'm trying to figure out in my own mind what triggers conversation on any of the points really, without showing a preference to one or the other. Does leaving community boards in as a status quo within the wider proposal, will that trigger the level of communication and interaction that we're looking for?
That's what they want.
Like, or do you have to almost be a bit inflammatory by taking it out to get the level of feedback that you're looking for?
So what we're doing now is going around just asking every elected member so that we get a gauge then on what your preferred option would be. So just put that in mind first and foremost. So is this board to have community at this table? The second thing to do is that we would include background information around why the elected members chose to keep or remove the community boards. But there was a robust discussion because of these aspects. And as a result, the council's considering setting up a rural advisory group. So I think you go out with the recommendation that you want to go with as a collective, but we can put rationale about a lot of discussion happened around community boards. There were some discussions about to remove them or retain them, and these are some of the discussion points. We welcome your feedback on that.
Okay. I just wanted to understand how the principle would actually be.
So you get what I'm going to say, Nikki.
Okay. Option 3, rural ward.
Three urban wards with 2 councillors in each, 3 rural wards with 1 councillor in each. The Murray ward is needed there because it's there, whether it's 5 beyond, who knows? And that's it. I get rid of community boards.
Hang on, so
I believe you can say that kind of stuff after making such a big deal about rural boards.
3 urban wards, 2 councillors in each. 3 rural
It's just
wards,
so
1 councillor.
So we end up with
You still keep
11.
your 9
No.
Your 9 councillors
No.
plus Maribor
Yeah,
council
so we end up with
with
11.
11, yeah. Because, and the reason I say that, because I'm not convinced that the referendum will go.
So read it first.
Yeah, I'm with the same number of councillors, and I like the idea of an advisory, rural advisory. The community boards, I'd like to look at options. So yeah, I'd like to look at advisory or the other. So I kind of like the idea of going out saying that we're going to get rid of them and go to competition kind of thing. Well, you know, like you were saying to.
You're gonna get more feedback that way. If they get rid of them, you
Yeah,
get feedback.
yeah, give me
If they keep
feedback,
them, you won't.
because I just feel 3-5 feedback is so statistically insignificant. How can we work on that? Yeah.
I'm not happy with going out with, get rid of them. Because we believe that's going to actually bring the information. I would rather say we have them. Would you like to see them there or not? You know, instead of saying we would like to remove them, how do you feel about that? You know, that's not the case. We have them and that's where we sit. And I think that should be the conversation, because I do not support removing community boards, only because it's, look, in Martinborough, it's, they tried to go around them once before and it got slammed.
But we've got to get the feedback. We can't.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can ask the question directly.
Yes.
But in a positive instead of a negative.
I don't answer. Yeah.
Well, it's a classification, we're going out with one, yes, so it's one option.
Yeah.
Sure, I don't know what it's gonna be, but I don't think it's elements of the option that you choose, so it's a all or nothing.
But when people submit, they'll be able to say, I support it, or I support it, but not that bit. Like, surely they'll be able to pick the bits they do or don't support. Whilst we've got to pick one proposal, people must be able to feed back on individual bits.
Yeah, because that's gonna be part of your hearings and deliberation process.
Yeah.
It
Absolutely.
has to be broken.
And we have booked in a workshop to go through the consultation document with you, so we're not gonna just show you all on the 31st of July for the very first time. So there is some work and that will happen with you all in July as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I suspect this has got a long way to go. For me, no real preference over one or two. Strong preferences. We're leaning more towards option 1 though, with the inclusion of the motor ward. Community boards go, but with the rural advisory group, I think that's a good idea.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah. David, feel free to email me or touch base if you've got any other questions. Thank you so much.